Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us. I say everybody. I assume there's somebody out there. But if there's just one of you, thanks. It's still well worth it. Um, it's been a few weeks since I've done this from my house, so I may be a little off tonight. Hope not. But we're going to continue in the book of Daniel. And last time we were in the book of Daniel, we did Daniel chapter 2, where we saw Nebuchadnezzar's dream, and Daniel and his friends were able to get the interpretation from God and secure themselves a place of position and authority in the Babylonian kingdom. In chapter 3, Nebuchadnezzar sort of takes a turn for the worse, and we have an interesting situation taking place there. And I think it's kind of important that we understand what's going on here. Chapter 3 of Daniel, we really see the willful side of Nebuchadnezzar as the king, as he pits himself against God, and he initiates a battle of faith versus fear between the king Nebuchadnezzar and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego as servants of God. And the world, it basically depicts the fact that the world will at times flex its muscle against God and his people. And whenever the enemy comes in like a flood, which is what happens here in this chapter, the scripture tells us that the Lord raises up a standard against him, which again, we will see take place in this chapter. In chapter 2, we saw God introduce himself to Nebuchadnezzar in a dream. And again, the book of Daniel, one of the characteristics of it is God revealing himself to the Gentile world. This began to happen in Daniel through the Babylonian Empire. So God introduced himself in chapter 2 with a dream of an image. It was a multi-metallic image in which Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom was the head of gold. Well, Nebuchadnezzar in chapter 3 decides that his kingdom is not going to give way to the next kingdom, but his kingdom is going to last forever. So he makes himself an entire image of gold to assert his claim that Babylon will never fall, basically in defiance to God. And so that's the setup for the chapter. So in verse 1 of chapter 3, it says, Nebuchadnezzar, the king, made an image of gold whose height was 60 cubits and its width 6 cubits. He set it up in the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. And King Nebuchadnezzar sent word to gather together the satraps, the administrators, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the officials of the province to come to the dedication of the image which King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And so then it goes on to say that they all showed up for the image dedication. So we're told here what Nebuchadnezzar did and what he was expecting to get out of it. He had built this image, he set it up in the plain of Dura, and now he's going to dedicate it. And he calls all of the officials from all over the empire to come to this dedication. Now, based on the stated measurements, the image stood 90 feet tall by 9 feet wide, which kind of makes it more of a, an obelisk instead of a statue, but nevertheless, it was quite big, and it was overlaid in gold, so it stood out and shone all over. The plains of Dura was a very wide, broad, flat area, and you could see for miles, so it must have been quite a sight as he set it up there. But the likeness of the image was most likely of Nebuchadnezzar himself. That's the kind of things they did back then. But the king set up this image in the plain of Dura, as I said, and this is about 4 miles outside of Babylon. And he called all the officials throughout all the empire to its dedication. And this was for the bureaucratic buy-in. He was about to initiate a huge change within his social structure. And in order to do this, he needed to have bureaucratic buy-in. So he brings all of these officials from the empire and he brings them in. All the top brass is invited. And it's going to be their job now to sell this project to the populace when they go back home. So they have to push it back down to the street level. And this is really a globalist objective that Nebuchadnezzar is setting up here. In implementing a world religion, he hopes to use it as a unifying principle that binds the populace or his population together in a way that he can manipulate and dictate. And we're kind of facing the same sort of thing today, I think. there is a similar globalist grab for power going on in the world today. Today, even in our country alone, and we are now, several months down the road from the initiation of this virus or this pandemic or all the things that it was billed as up front. But we're down the road quite a few months, and most people have returned to a semi-normal life. But there remains today 11 democratic states that are still shut down, where at least churches are still shut down. They're not allowed to gather at all in 11 democratic principalities or states. In Nevada, for instance, all the casinos are open up to half capacity. So if the casino fits 10,000 people, they can put 5,000 people in there. And people can stand next to each other at the slot machines all day long, and it's completely fine. Yet churches in Nevada are not allowed to gather in groups greater than 50 people, to stand together in prayer in a group greater than 50 people. So we see that this is a very targeted effort. And I've said for weeks that this is really a spiritual warfare that's been targeted at the church or toward the church. And we see that playing out now. We see now the church being the last to be released from this hold in these democratic areas. And it's a shame, but it's the kind of things that people do when power goes to their head. Men cannot control power. And absolute power especially is so narcotic that men lose their mind over it and begin to terribly treat their fellow man. But just like Nebuchadnezzar's phony idol here, our situation has really less to do with sickness and public safety than it does with politics. Essentially, what Nebuchadnezzar is doing here is a political move, but it's in a religious area. And so we have all of these, the medical and the economic and the spiritual things all shut down and manipulated in this country for the same reason. It's a way to manipulate a political goal through other means. And here the king is attempting this social engineering project, and he has to have buy-in from all of his top administrators to pull it off. And so the same holds true in the situation in our country. But Nebuchadnezzar has basically three problems, and they're named Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They too are administrators in the province of Babylon, and their presence there is to ensure really that God has a witness and a testimony. As the dedication day arrives, the herald makes a proclamation, and basically in verse 3 or 4 through 6, he basically tells everybody, when you hear all the music, you hear the harps and the flutes and the horns and the harp and lyre and psalter and all of the symphony of music, that everybody is to bow down and worship the image that Nebuchadnezzar had built. And those who will not bow down and worship will be cast immediately into the burning fiery furnace. Now, it probably doesn't take a long stretch for you to connect that to what happens in the book of Revelation with the Antichrist himself, where he builds an image and demands everybody bows down and worships to it on the threat of death. And so we have basically a precursor of that here with Nebuchadnezzar. But this was more than a dedication of a public works project, as you can see. This was really to be used to subject all religious duty to the king's control. And so this is a manipulative process that is using other things as inputs to accomplish a completely separated end. And the separated end is his control of religion. But he's using other inputs to bring about his control of religion. The administrators would then have the responsibility, as I said, of going back and selling this to the populace. But I wanted you to notice, the reason why I made the thing about the music and everything, is I wanted you to notice the use of this king, or by this king, of professional musicians. The king has really kind of put together his own worship band. And you've probably noticed also that especially over the past few months, we have seen a lot more of the liberal wing's use of well-known actors, musicians, and athletes as their spokespersons. We've seen that sort of increase as we see these actors and these athletes and these musicians, getting on basically bored with the liberal agenda and encouraging us to, protect everybody, stay home, and all of the other things. But they make good use of Hollywood and of sports stars, to push their agenda on people. And the reason why that works is because the sad reality is that too many people really don't have their own life. And it's like some weird parasitical existence. They basically live vicariously through, some super fan connection that they make with either actors or, sports stars or whatever. So we are a society basically of hero worshipers, is what I'm trying to say. And so when they parade our heroes in front of us, we tend to listen to them more than we would just the guy in the street. And they know that, and they use it as a tool. And Nebuchadnezzar's doing the same thing here. We, the liberals, really have made sure that they make good use of all the tools in their toolbox, and this is just one of them. So the king has put together his own worship band, popular people, just to help the process farther. But he's kind of like Nimrod. He actually sees religion as a means of unifying all the different cultures together in his kingdom. And so he creates a religion to centralize everything within himself. And Rome basically did the same thing. The Antichrist will do the same thing. The problem for Nebuchadnezzar is that he has some people in his employ who are not going along with the program. As I said, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego refused to bow. The drama in chapter 3 really revolves around then this standoff between Nebuchadnezzar and these three young Jewish teenagers. He on his side with murderous threats toward them. They on their side with faith. And the question is, which is going to win the day? Is it faith, or is it this all-powerful mighty king? Who's going to win? All power is with him, no power is with these three teenagers. And it's quite a drama that goes on here. And it's not unlike the things we're going through today. All the power is on one side, none of the power is on the other side. But God is on the other side. And when God's on that side, then you have all the power and all the ability and all the purpose you need. So our problem is when we forget that we're on God's side. Anyway, they didn't. They continued to stand in faith. So they're there representing God. Representing the devil is all the secular power and authority the world can bring to bear. And this is the kind of situation where it's perfect for God's strength to be made perfect in our weaknesses. So when the gauntlet is thrown down here, everyone is commanded to worship. The music plays. And each individual standing there has to decide what they're going to do, how they will respond. And oddly, as we read through the chapter, we find that everybody bowed down to the image except Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who remained standing. Now, in that crowd, I have no doubt you have a cross-section of society, including believers. The vast majority of the people in the crowd are already idol worshipers, no doubt, and they need little encouragement beyond the music itself to bow down and worship, because that's what they're used to. Then there were those who's had primary concern for keeping their position, and that concern outweighed the evils of idol worship, so they bow to the command, even though they're not prone or inclined to do so on their own. Then there were those whose conscience would be violated by bowing, but they do it anyway out of fear of death. And then lastly and finally, you have only a few. In fact, out of the hundreds standing there, you have just three who by faith refused to bow at all, and they put their life on the line by doing so. It is in those few, those three teenagers, it is those three that the devil goes after, and it is those three whom God defends in a marvelous and miraculous way. They didn't incite rebellion. They didn't do anything that would bring attention to themselves. They didn't call for demonstrations. They didn't ask anybody else to join with them. They simply, in faith, obeyed God and did not bow to the idol in faithfulness to God's commandment. So, but nevertheless, their refusal to bow gets them in trouble, and their enemies turn them in. And we're told that the Chaldeans, in verse 8, the Chaldeans came to Nebuchadnezzar, the king, and informed on these three young men for not bowing to the image. The interesting thing is in chapter 2, the Chaldeans were one group of people that these three men in Daniel had saved. They saved their lives. These guys, the Chaldeans, were all destined for death, and they had actually been saved by the intervention of Daniel and his three friends. And now they return that kindness by turning in these three young men and trying to get them in trouble. But here's what they say. They say there are certain Jews whom you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon. Now, because they say certain Jews, they have a direct connection to these guys. They know exactly who they're talking about, and it reveals a motive behind what they're doing here. There are certain Jews whom you've put over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, they say, have not paid due regard to you. They do not serve your gods or worship the gold image which you have set up. So they make two charges. One is they don't pay regard and they're not worshiping your image. The first charge is completely false, and it was born of envy. There was no administrators in all of the kingdom that served the king more faithfully than these three young men and Daniel had. And to have due regard is really to have respect for one's authority and position. And they had all proper respect for the king, but they also knew that no king has the authority to compel them to do what God has forbidden, or to prevent them or prohibit them from doing what God has commanded. So they do have respect for the king. They honor him. They faithfully fulfill their duties. They give him all due regard. But when it comes to the domain where God alone has the authority in their life, they do not allow the king to impede or in any way violate that authority, and they're right in doing so. And so the first thing that they did not show due regard was not true. It was true that they didn't bow down to his gods or his images, but that's a totally different matter that speaks to moral conscience rather than civic duty. And I make a point of this because I think that believers really need to recognize the difference. I don't think we always do a good job of recognizing the difference between moral conscience and civic duty. Civic duty and moral conscience are two different areas of operation. One belongs to God and one belongs to the civil authority. Believers today need to recognize where the line is drawn and make sure they give due regard to the right authority. Secular authority applies to our civic duty alone, civil affairs only. A human government has not been granted authority over matters of conscience, or worship, or belief systems, or religion, or our standing before God. They have not been given that authority by God. And when we are told in Scripture to pay due regard and to submit to the powers that be because they're ordained by God, the assumption is that they are operating within the confines of the boundaries that God has set for them. And they are not violating God's commandment or forcing us to violate God's commandment. So as long as that's the case, then yeah, we do all full obedience. But as soon as there is a pressure and a opposition between what the authority says and what God says, we have to make a decision. We are to have due regard for both God and rulers. Each one has its proper domain. But in cases of man's overreach, the conflict is created by man, and our duty is toward God, and it outweighs any contrary obligations imposed by the secular authority. And what I mean by that is, if you believe that the Scripture says not to forsake the assembling of ourselves together, you believe that that is a command or an injunction from God as a matter of faith, then nobody has the right to tell you not to gather together. Nobody has the authority. Now, they may impose authority on you. They may even throw you in jail for doing it, or persecute you, or kill you, or whatever for doing it. But the point is, they are outside the bound of their authority. You are not obligated to obey, but you may well face consequences. These young men knew that. They understood that fully. and they decided that the consequences were better than disobedience. So they stand firm on the basis of that truth, that the government does not have the ability to compel them to disobey God, and so they refuse to bow. This was not a real crisis, but an invented one. We're familiar with invented crises, and that's what happened here. Nebuchadnezzar has invented a crisis, and now it's gotten to the point where 3 men are about to lose their life for obeying God. It was a situation created by the king for social engineering purposes. It was an attempt to create a culturally neutral world through commonly shared idol worship. But the king didn't really expect the unneutral reaction of God's people. And you could tell that by his anger toward Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He gets, his psychology goes way off the charts here. You can see his passive-aggressive nature just come to the surface as soon as he finds out that these young men, or that anybody has disobeyed him. But these young men knew what they were getting into. They had worked with Nebuchadnezzar. They knew his nature. They knew his personality. They knew exactly what they would face for not bowing, and they chose not to because they chose to trust God. Now, the thing that I noticed here is we all really want God to move mightily on our behalf. And we look at the book of Acts and we see all the things that God did through the believers and healing people and casting out demons, and just, we see faith working so miraculously in the lives of people. And we ask, why doesn't God do that to us? Or what's wrong with us? What have we lost? What have we changed? Why isn't that happening? We all want God to move mightily on our behalf, just as we see him doing on behalf of the saints so often in Scripture. But the fact of the matter is, unless we are in a place where we are putting our faith and our future on the line, the normal laws of cause and effect work out well enough for us. God doesn't use the supernatural in areas where the natural works out just fine. So if we're never stepping out in the supernatural, if we're never putting our faith on the line, if we're never putting our future on the line for God, we're never getting into an area where we're beyond the normal laws of cause and effect. And therefore, God never has a reason to step in with a supernatural remedy for our case as he does here. We operate in normal faith that really doesn't go beyond the realm of normal cause and effect. And that's typically what we see in our lives. We see good effect because God blesses it, but we don't see miraculous effect because we're not on the bleeding edge of faith as the apostles and disciples were in the New Testament. But in verses 16 through 18, these young men doubled down. The king says, hey, you got a chance now to fix this. I'll have them play music again. You bow down and worship, things will be cool. If you don't, I'm going to throw you in the oven, in the furnace, and burn you to death. And so they double down. They say, hey, you can do what you want. We don't even have to be careful how we answer you. We already know what we're going to do. We trust God, and he can save us. But even if he doesn't, we don't care. We're not going to bow to your image. This makes him furious. But it's a wonderful testimony. They're trusting God for the outcome in spite of the king's fury. It's a wonderful testimony, and it's typical of the saints of the ages. There have been millions who have laid down their lives on the altar of God's service by refusing to compromise their faith, just like these 3 young men are doing. We don't see a lot of that personally because we haven't been in a circumstance where we've had to face that a lot in this country, but it's happened a lot in other countries throughout the world consistently. And it's beginning to happen here, and it's going to happen increasingly here. We are going to see more and more persecution. We're going to see more and more opposition, and we're going to see more and more rules written and laws written against the church and against faith and against Christ. And we're going to have to decide how we're going to deal with that when that time comes. But they're not willing to compromise their faith, just like the millions who have laid down their lives before them. They refuse to compromise faith. These guys know that the idol is a lie, that's an affront to God. And the big thing is that they refuse to confuse the world about God by dignifying it. And that's the key thing. They have a testimony to maintain. They've been around for a while. All of these guys, including the Chaldeans who ratted on them, know their testimony. They know they trust God. And the world cannot afford to allow the world to see them bowing down to an image and corrupt the world's view of God. They have to put their lives on the line for God's sake here. And maybe even they didn't want to. Perhaps none of them wanted to be willing to give their lives, but they knew that duty called for them to represent God properly here and not confuse the world by their actions. And so that's what they did. And they ended up putting their life on the line by doing it. We have been, let me just say, reluctant to even come close to that standard. But we will be in the near future Christians who, if we are going to survive, we will need to be at that standard or we will get crushed. And so these guys stand on faith and they trust God, and that's all they can do in the circumstance. Now, secular authority hates to be told no. Power is proud and egotistical, and hates to be confronted, hates to be told no. And so that's what happens here. The king gets even more enraged at their refusal, and he has the furnace heated up 7 times hotter than normal, so that he can really cook them good. I guess it's 7 really is the number of completion, and so basically it's a way of saying as hot as it can possibly get. And we're told that the soldiers who bound them and tossed them in the fire was so hot that they died from their injuries from the flame, but that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego fell down in the midst of the furnace in the flame. They watched them fall on the floor of the furnace and then stand up. And then suddenly there's a 4th person with them. And he's described by the king as one like a son of the gods, is what the real literal translation is. But most Bibles translate it the son of God. But Nebuchadnezzar didn't know who the son of God was. He basically said, like a son of the gods. There was something unique, different about this 4th individual that placed him in the category of divinity to Nebuchadnezzar. Whatever that was, that's what Nebuchadnezzar saw. And I have to say, personally, of all the pre-incarnate appearances of Christ in the Old Testament, and there are many, this is one of the most interesting to me, both theologically and prophetically. For Jesus to, in a pre-incarnate manifestation, to appear within this fiery furnace with these 3 young men and walk with them and talk with them through this ordeal is quite unique among the what are called theophanies in the Old Testament. Theologically, though, it's really a picture of how in all of our ways the Lord is acquainted with our griefs and sorrows, and how he shields us from the storm and strengthens our faith in the midst of trial and secures our victory for us. All of these things are represented by Christ here in the flame with them. But it's also a gem of end times prophecy. This chapter has both theological and prophetic significance for us. It's wonderfully consistent in its implications with the book of Revelation and what the New Testament says about the church, about the rapture, and about the tribulation period. As Jesus is standing with them, and he protects them from both harm and discomfort. They're not even sweating. And they're even walking back and forth, as I said, through the flames as they're conversing with Jesus. And the flame that purifies, God's own people is the one that burns up his enemies. And here, God uses it as a means of purification. Whenever the secular authorities turn up the heat on the church, they actually turn it up on themselves and not on God's people. God sort of reverses that on them. And the Bible says that no weapon formed against us can prosper. And the only thing burned away from these young men were the ropes that bound them. They weren't touched in any other way. And that's the way God uses trials. And God uses the anger and the wrath of the world against us. He turns it for our deliverance. And then the remainder of wrath, he turns back on themselves. So we have every reason, like these young men, to have complete faith in God, and in consequence, as long as we're trusting, believing, and obeying God. That's really the point of this chapter. We have nothing to fear. Even a furnace that's heated up 7 times hotter than normal. But we'll just close with these last verses. We're told that in verses 26 and 27 that Nebuchadnezzar looked inside, and he looked went near the mouth of the furnace, and he spoke to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and he calls them servants of the Most High God, and he says, "Come out and come here." And they came out from the midst of the fire, and everyone looked at them and saw that the fire had no power on their bodies. Their hair wasn't singed. They didn't smell like smoke. Their garments weren't affected. The only thing, as I said, that was different was they no longer were bound by ropes. They were free completely. And this is an interesting turnaround because Nebuchadnezzar says to them, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here. And it's an interesting turnaround because before, when he threw them into the oven, these men were his servants to do with as he wished. Because he said to them, hey, there is no God who can save you from me if you don't bow down and do what I tell you to do. So they're his servants to do with as he wish. He throws them in a furnace because they disobey him. But now he's gained a brand new appreciation for the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Now they're no longer his servants, but he calls them servants of the Most High God. And people, that is our testimony. That's what happens when we just simply stand in faith. People see it. And people recognize the power and the authority of God in our lives. And they see us as servants of the Most High God, not because we say we are, not because we act like it, not because we try to put on airs around them and drum it up, but because they see the reality of it in our lives. They see the power of it in our lives. They see us overcoming and standing where other people fail and falter. So he calls them servants of the Most High God because he's learned by their actions that that's exactly who they are and nothing else. Now, in the previous chapter, Nebuchadnezzar saw God as the revealer of secrets. He told Daniel at the end of the chapter, your God is truly the revealer of secrets. But he didn't see him in any other way than that, either just a God who had special insight to what people were dreaming or secrets that people had. But here, he's getting a new understanding of God. Now he's being introduced to a greater degree to who God is, and he sees God as one who is mighty to save, which, previously, again, at the start of the chapter, he said, who is the God that can save you from my hand? Now he knows the answer to that question. But in verse 28, he extols, the king Nebuchadnezzar extols the glory of God. And this is what he says, the God who sent his angel and delivered his servants who trusted in him, and they have frustrated the king's word and yielded their bodies that they should not serve nor worship any God except their own. Look at the verbs in that verse. He delivered, trusted, frustrated, yielded. It talks about what they did and what God did. They trusted and yielded. God delivered and frustrated the king. He delivered them and frustrated the king. God delivered his servants who trusted and yielded, but then he turned it back on the king. And the point is that it takes our partnership. We yield, we trust, and then God takes care of the rest. He takes care of the deliverance and of frustrating the command of the king. Our job is not to frustrate the command of the king. Our job is not to fight against the government. Our job is not to protest, not to march, not to armed resistance, but to trust God and let God take care of the resistance. But when we trust God, we trust him in full assurance of faith and we obey. Trust is obedience. You cannot have trust apart from obedience. So these guys put their trust in a tangible fashion by their obedience. But prophetically speaking, let's just go over the prophecy real quick as we close this out. Prophetically speaking, Nebuchadnezzar represents the Antichrist in his kingdom. He is a type of the Antichrist, and this chapter is a type of the tribulation period. The institution of a one world government and one world religion, which he is trying to do here, the use of an image to solicit worship, the forcing of compliance among dissenters by the threat of death, the fiery trials, these are all part of the realities of the tribulation period. The fiery furnace heated up 7 times hotter represents the 7-year period of the tribulation itself. And Jesus said it would be a time of unparalleled suffering, death, and destruction on earth. He said such as had never been before and never will be again. And so we see this furnace heated 7 times hotter than normal, is just enormously hot. That represents the tribulation period, which is going to be an enormously unparalleled time of suffering, death, and destruction on the earth. But the 3 young Jewish men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they represent the 144,000 Jewish witnesses that were handpicked by Christ in the book of Revelation. We see them in chapter 7 of the book of Revelation, 144,000, 12,000 from each tribe among Israel. They are Jews. They are God's handpicked witnesses. They are super apostles who go throughout the world during these 7 years, and they evangelize the world. They will go through intense sorrow, loss, suffering, and persecution, but they will be specially marked by God, and their lives will be protected by Christ, just as these 3 young men were protected in this fiery furnace. No harm came upon them. So we're told in Revelation that these 144,000 will be protected by Christ, and they will come through the tribulation period alive, every single one of them. Of all that you've given me, I have not lost one, and that includes the 144,000 that were given to him during the tribulation period. They have a ministry to fulfill, and they fulfill it completely. We have been sometimes told by teachers that all Christians or all believers during the tribulation period are going to be marked by God. That is incorrect. It's not according to what the scripture says. The book of Revelation actually only says those 144,000 will be marked and will make it through the tribulation period alive. So they have this special category, and they are, as I said, identified as Jews. The institution of a one world government, the buy-in of global administrators, informing on friends and family, the imposing of a global religious cult and idol worship, fiery judgments, and the special persecution of believers, these all converge in the tribulation period. And you know, we're being set up for all of that now. I mean, we've had it pretty easy for a number of decades. In fact, for centuries. The church in America has not really had to deal with a lot of the things that the church proper throughout the rest of the world has had to deal with. And now it's come home to roost. And we're going to have to get used to it. And we're going to have to learn how to deal with it properly. And so, but all of these things are going to converge and going to come to a head at the tribulation period. We're not going to see anything on that level, but we will see things that we are certainly not used to and certainly not comfortable with. But where Daniel, the question is where is Daniel in all of this? All through this chapter, he's not even mentioned. But the church, like Daniel, is conspicuously missing during the tribulation period. Here, Daniel is conspicuous for his absence. He appears in every other chapter of his book. He's spoken of. In fact, he is often the speaker in every other chapter. But this one chapter, Daniel is nowhere to be found. He's not heard of. He's just gone. And the fact of the matter is that because this is a type of the tribulation, Daniel is a type of the church who's been raptured before chapter 3 comes about. And so the only ones left are Daniel's 3 friends, because Daniel, representing the church, has been removed from the scene. During the tribulation, the church will be removed in the rapture. Then the tribulation will begin. In the tribulation, there will be no church. I'll say that again. There will be no church. Not like we think of it. The church in tribulation period will be distinctly Jewish. The gospel will be placed in the hands of believing Jews during the tribulation, and the tribulation church will have a distinctly Jewish flavor, and I'll show you that in a minute. And all who are saved during that period, during the tribulation period, come in under Israel's dispensation, and they are not, strictly speaking, a part of the church. The church is a unique and special entity that that starts at Pentecost and then closes its door at the rapture. At that time, the church is completed and will not be added to. The believers that come out of the tribulation period come out as part of Israel's fruit and part of Israel's dispensation. The church really is the apostolic, the bride is really the apostolic church, which is taken in the rapture. Now, in the just to prove this out, let me give you some examples. In the parable of the 10 virgins, when the 5 who had forgotten their oil had to go and buy oil, they came back, and we're told, Jesus told us in the parable that when they came back with their oil, they knocked on the door to get into the feast. And the bridegroom opened the door, and he replied to them, I tell you the truth, I don't know you. Wait a minute. They were just 5 of the 10 virgins who were waiting for the Lord to come back. 5 of them were ready and went. These 5 got themselves ready and then came back. But he says, I don't know you. What he's saying is, I don't recognize you as my bride. Not that they're not saved, but they're not part of that specific and unique entity called the bride of Christ. I don't know you. I don't recognize you as my bride. If you miss the rapture, the bride is complete, and the only way you come in is under Israel's dispensation. You will not be a part of the bride of Christ. Not that that's a big deal necessarily. I mean, you're going to be with the Lord. That's really what matters for any of us. But let me go on to prove this a little bit further, that the Jews are given the responsibility of the gospel. In Revelation chapter 12, verses 1 through 5, John tells us he sees a sign. Whenever people say, the book of Revelation, is that stuff, is it symbolic or is it real? How am I supposed to interpret it? And the interesting thing about the book of Revelation is when John sees a sign or something symbolic, he tells us it's a sign. If he doesn't say, I saw a sign, then what he's describing to you, he literally is seeing. It's not a vision. It's not a sign. It's something he literally sees. Here in chapter 12, verse 1 through 5, he sees a sign. He says, I saw a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a garland of 12 stars. Now this, if you go back to Genesis chapter 37, this is from Joseph's dream. Joseph had a dream where the sun and the moon and 11 stars bowed down to him. He told his dad about it, and his dad said, shall I and your mother and your brothers truly bow down to you? And so Jacob interpreted the dream of the sun and moon and stars as representing Israel. And so here, John sees this same sign. He sees a woman clothed with the sun and the moon, which is representative of Jacob and Rachel. And then, then with the moon and the garland of 12 stars is representative of the 12 tribes of Israel. So the picture is of Israel. I know a lot of people interpret this as a church, but there is no basis for it whatsoever. This is straight from, as I said, Genesis chapter 37 has to do with Joseph and his brothers. Now, then in verse 2, if you don't believe that, we'll look at verse 2. Verse 2 says, then being with child, she cried out in labor and in pain to give birth. Okay, so now this woman is also pregnant and getting ready to bear a child. If she's the church, then the church is to be presented to Christ as a chaste virgin. So now the church is knocked up. Something's gone wrong. We got an issue here. But this is not the church. Another sign appeared in heaven in verse 3. John, he says, a great sign, a fiery red dragon having 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 diadems on his heads. This is the Antichrist, of course. With the 10 horns, you can tell it's the dragon. It relates to Satan. But it says his tail drew 1/3 of the stars from heaven and threw them to the earth. Most commentators see that as the number of angels who sided with the devil. 1/3 of the angels fell with him, is the way most people interpret that. But here's the important part. The dragon stood before the woman who is ready to give birth to devour her child as soon as it was born. So the dragon representing the devil is standing before this woman who is represented by Israel, who is about to give birth to a child. And as soon as this child is born, the dragon hopes to devour it. But we're told in verse 5 that she bore a male child who was to rule all nations with a rod of iron, and the child was caught up to God and to his throne. Okay, finally. So the church does not give birth to Christ. The church is married to Christ. Israel gave birth to Christ. So if you really are honest with the scriptures and you just read this through from verse 1 to 5 and just believe what it says, there's no question that this is talking about Israel. So if you can accept that, let me go on to apply it to what we've been talking about. In verse 13 and 14 of that same chapter, we're told that the serpent or the dragon hated the woman and went after her to persecute her. And in verse 14, we're told that the woman was given 2 wings of a great eagle, that she could fly into the wilderness to a place that had been prepared for her by God, where she'll be nourished for a time, times and a half a time. A time, times and a half time is 3.5 years. So in mid-tribulation, this woman, who I say is Israel, is persecuted to the extent, this is when the Antichrist double crosses Israel, and the believers, that is the Christians, those who believe in Christ, are compelled to hide. He goes after them in particular, but they have a place prepared for them by God, and they're able to get away from him and be protected there, according to John in Revelation, for the last half of the tribulation period. Then in verse 17, it says, "But the dragon was still enraged with the woman, and he went off to make war with the rest of her offspring." So he couldn't get to Israel directly because they were being protected by God. So he went to the rest of her offspring. And what that's telling us is those who are born again in tribulation are the offspring of Israel, her offspring. And it doesn't mean her offspring in the sense that we are all the offspring of Israel, in that Messiah came from Israel, therefore we all. There's a more direct relationship here, and that's in the next sentence. We see that her offspring who keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus Christ. Do you see the distinctly Jewish flavor of the Christianity of the tribulation period? They are practicing the same Christianity that the apostles, the Jerusalem apostles, practiced, where they maintained a certain relationship with the law, with the Mosaic law. They didn't put their trust in it. Their salvation wasn't in it. They trusted Christ. They had faith in Christ, but they maintained a certain relationship to the Torah, to the commandments of God. And here we have this Christianity in the rest of her offspring in the tribulation period do 2 things. They keep the commandments of God, like the Jewish Christians did in the New Testament, and they have the testimony of Jesus Christ. These are Gentile believers. They are the ones who now the Antichrist will go after. And Daniel tells us in chapter 7 of Daniel that he sees the Antichrist having victory over the saints and just decimating them, and he's grieved and he's broken, and his heart's broken. He can't understand it, and God has to come back and tell him what's going on. But the fact of the matter is the Gentiles will be who come to Christ will be severely persecuted by the Antichrist. So here's the thing. I'll close with this. The church won't be there. We are not going to be in chapter 3.
There's a 4th person.
Huh?
Ed said there's a 4th person.